There's a paradox with the blues. Kalama Ya Salam, his original name was Val Ferdinand. He's a kind of mojo man. And this is what he says. The blues ain't slave music. Didn't no slaves sing the blues. We didn't become blue until after Reconstruction. After Freedom Day and the dashing of all hopes of receiving, attaining our promised 40 acres and a mule.
Imagine a railway siding in Turner, Mississippi, on a mild February evening in 1903. A well-dressed black man sits listlessly as he tries to catch a furtive nap on a bench, his baggage for a pillow, cornet case tucked under the bench. His hope of sleep is dashed as further down, another man takes a seat and proceeds to pick at a guitar. Our hero, endlessly curious about new musical sounds, rises to observe him. Thereupon he sees and describes
a lean, loose-jointed Negro who had commenced plucking the guitar beside me while I slept. His clothes were rags, his feet peeped out of his shoes, his face had on it some of the sadness of the ages. As he played, he pressed a knife on the strings in a manner popularized by Hawaiian guitarists who used steel bars. The effect was unforgettable. His song, too, struck me instantly. The singer repeated the line, "Going where the Southern Cross the Yellow Dog," 3 times, accompanying himself on the guitar with the weirdest music I had ever heard.
Thus, the local black folk music, unwritten and loosely defined in style, came into contact with one of the most inventive, disciplined, yet troubled musical minds of its generation. This is where W.C. Handy met the blues. To be strictly correct, he didn't meet the blues. The blues came to be a musical term about half a dozen years later, and Handy himself didn't use it for another 10. But what he heard was what we would recognize dimly as the blues, and that's as the myth would have it. The reality is somewhat more complex. Conventional wisdom has it that the blues was a synthesis, a distillation of disparate music forms brought over from Africa by slaves and modified through exposure to hymnody and the rhythms of field work. However, later theorists in the black community have claimed that the blues is a later development, emerging from more diverse approaches derived from the African music hymnody fusion of the late 1870s, early 1880s, through a number of reasons, largely through the rise of itinerant musicians and the development of a differentiation between performers and audiences. Previously, African American music had been almost wholly communal, derived from the field hollers, a solo voice singing free song in an untimed, melismatic style, or work songs, call and response singing with strong rhythmic elements, ring shouts, which were free-form solo voice accompanied by mass percussion, playing polyrhythmic juju, and the spiritual tradition, highly disciplined chorally but very free-form and ecstatic in its solo vocals out front. The music was designed to be performed by masses. The blues, as it emerged in the 30 years from 1880, was these forms being packed down so that one musician could perform them. In order to do this, the guitar supplanted the banjo as the primary stringed instrument. While the banjo was great for cutting through the noise of mass singing, the guitar allowed for intimate one-to-many performance. It was also more portable, generally cheaper and easier to obtain than a banjo. Lord knows it kept its tune better, and importantly it allowed for string bends and slide playing, which led to more expressive vocals. Once the mass of African Americans evolved from the living performers of their music and began to become the consumers of it, the music began to become more structured, more repeatable, and started to fall into the 8, 9, and eventually 12-bar patterns we know from recordings. Another influence on formalizing the music was there was a number of hot piano players in Texas who played a 12-bar barrelhouse style, which was popular at dances and parties and was widely adopted by guitar players as it made for good dance music. Thus, by the early 1920s, the various fixed bar patterns had become pretty much universal. Although diametrically opposite as a form to the blues, and much more closely allied with jazz, ragtime was an important influence in so much as ragtime encouraged virtuosity, and this influenced 2 important schools. The stride piano players led by Willie the Lion Smith through the First World War into the 1920s, who took their cue from ragtime but applied blues structures, and the Piedmont bluesmen of the Carolinas and Georgia, who developed intricate finger-picking styles based on ragtime's syncopated rhythms. W.C. Handy, a man as devoted to making money as he was to music, perhaps more so, given that he gave up music on a number of occasions for better-paying civilian jobs, no doubt saw something unique and marketable in this obscure regional sound. But it was 6 years before he put his new music into form when he composed an early version of what was to become Memphis Blues as a campaign song for the then incumbent mayor of Memphis. Handy noticed the success of the song and that crowds listening to it started to write their own words to it, all of which seemed to revolve around the phrase Memphis Blues. By 1912, Handy had rewritten the melody and, most importantly, copyrighted the song, taking it from an obscure local form to a potentially much wider audience. The next step was even greater. Judging by the 1916 recording of it by the Victor Military Band, Handy's vision of the blues was a much more sophisticated and musically literate version of what he heard on that lonesome railway stop, bearing a distinct Latin influence, which was a hallmark of most early blues. It's a nod to New Orleans, which had a strong Latin influence in it via it being the primary port for incoming Cuban trade, and was seen as a much more musically refined influence than that of rural Mississippi. Handy, as both a musical snob, was always trying to make black music respectable. Thus was set the template for the blues from the earliest years of its development as a written and recorded form, and one which went unchallenged until the mid-1920s, when the big city labels started sending out field scouts and finding local equivalents of the Raggedy Man of Turner in the Carolinas, Georgia, Arkansas, Texas, and almost as an afterthought, the home of that very Raggedy Man, Mississippi. It was here that obscure local forms which represented the true diversity of what was blanketed as the blues was first discovered. The obscure local forms, as they were broadening their audience as well, only more slowly. In 1912, a feisty young belter out of Chattanooga, Tennessee, Bessie Smith, joined a travelling musicians troupe led by a gentleman called Moses Stokes. Her brother Clarence was part of the troupe, and its star was the formidable Gertrude Ma Rainey. Rainey took Smith under her wings and schooled her in the blues and stagecraft and, some say, in the ways of love. After moving on from the Stokes troupe, Smith based herself out of Atlanta, where she worked in chorus lines, before striking out in 1918 as a solo artist once she moved to the notorious Toba circuit, a black-owned, black-booked agency who stole from their artists every chance they got. Rainey said that Toba stood for tough on black asses. As soon as she had surpassed Rainey as the premier singer of the new blues music, her ability to project with volume while still being able to shade her vocal, her rough, take-no-shit stage presence, and her unbounded energy, her trademark was apparently to spit on stage, made her a huge star, to the point where she became the highest-paid black entertainer in the land, travelling in her own private rail car and acting as her own promoter. In 1920, OK Records in New York released Mamie, no relation, Smith's Crazy Blues, the first record written, played on, and sung by all black artists. Smith's two previous sides were pop songs written by W.C. Handy. Selling over 100,000 copies, which was a great deal for those times, record companies immediately saw a new market and began to sweep up female blues singers. Alberta Hunter was recording on Black Swan in May 1921 and Paramount by early 1922. Ma Rainey was snatched up by Paramount and held sessions at the end of 1923, and Bessie Smith was in the studio herself by February 1923. In all, for Columbia, she cut 152 sides and a further 4 at the end of her career for OK. She has 3 records in the Grammy Hall of Fame: Downhearted Blues, Empty Bed Blues, and St. Louis Blues. St. Louis Blues is considered the song which Bessie Smith is most closely tethered to, and rightly so. For while she had had earlier, later, and bigger hits, this is a record that stands by itself in the canon of American recorded music as a masterwork, representing as it does both the power of innovative arrangement and the singer's pure craft. The song itself is as old as the written blues is, written by Handy in 1914. It has been recorded many hundreds of times in any variety of arrangements, so much so that it, as a touchstone of the blues, has been called the Hamlet of jazz. Original arrangements and the earliest recordings have a strong Latin influence, including a tango introduction, originally written by Handy, but Smith strips all of this away, relying only on Fred Longshaw's baleful harmonium and the great Louis Armstrong's cry-influenced cornet line, returning this to the elemental simplicity which, from our perspective, we associate with the blues. And then there's Smith's vocal, an object lesson in light and shade, if not the object lesson in light and shade. Again, the performance reduces rather than embellishes, and it achieves more. The vocal for St. Louis Blues is all the more remarkable given that it was not recorded with an electric mic. Smith didn't use the electric recording process until she recorded Careless Love 4 months later. It shows the complete mastery of vocal textures and her ability to get inside a song and bring its remarkable and earthy lyric to life. More than anyone else, it was Smith that turned the blues into a viable business. She sold 6 million records in her first 4 years on Columbia, and all this never having set foot west of the Rocky Mountains. She reconnected the blues with the everyday worries, fears, and sadnesses of black people, all the time pandering to the aspirations of a carefree life, dancing the hoochie coo in a sequined gown to packed houses night after night. She understood this because she'd suffered as they had. She'd been born into abysmal poverty, horsewhipped and run out of town by segregationists. Her record company paid her no royalties on her sales. They did pay $200 a side, though, which was the highest rate that anyone in the business got those days. Her relatives robbed her blind, and she was once stabbed in the stomach by a crazy fan. She suffered and she made others suffer in other ways. She was a violent alcoholic who once literally ripped most of the hair out of the head of a woman she believed her common-law husband was cheating with, while she was cheating on him with men and women. She spent plenty of time in jail for assaults, disorderly conduct, and illegal drinking. Yet Smith went on to greater triumphs in her career. Shows, hit records, movies, well, a movie called Tellingly St. Louis Blues, and she's quite a good actress, and eternal enshrinement as the Empress of the Blues. As the Depression loomed and the blues boom waned, Smith began to retarget her songs towards jazz, pop, and even folk recordings, all to great artistic success and, if not at the level of her previous triumphs, respectable sales performances. But in the end, she came to the end of her road with Columbia and went back onto the road, again in reduced circumstances, but still as big a draw and as hot a show as there ever was. After 4 years out of contract, she did cut 2 remarkable sides for OK in 1934, Do Your Duty and Gimme a Pigfoot and a Bottle of Beer. But the legend was well enshrined by then. Strangely, those last 2 sides for OK were cut on Friday the 24th of November 1933. On the following Monday, Billie Holiday made her first ever recordings. A baton had been passed. Bessie Smith is a titanic figure in American popular music. Had she not emerged, it may have been the blues and all it influenced would be mere sideshows in the carnival of the world's musics. Or perhaps the gifted Alberta Hunter would have taken her place, or Ma Rainey roused her energy to claim a similar primacy amongst blues singers, or Mamie Smith would have capitalised on her breakthrough success instead of heading back to vaudeville. But, talented as these performers were, and fine as the records they made may have been, none of them were Bessie Smith. She was the whole package, the perfect fusion of talent, technique, presentation, and personality. If it were only for her pioneering work in studio technique, making the electric microphone an expressive instrument, which predated Bing Crosby's work by a year, she would still be a major figure, and owed a debt by all who came after her. Her story came to a gruesome end in 1937, dying of injuries sustained in a car wreck outside Clarksdale, Mississippi. Clarksdale, the birthplace of Sam Cooke, John Lee Hooker, and Ike Turner, where the Empress of the Blues departed this mortal coil, refused treatment at a whites-only hospital, and having to be ferried across town to a hospital that would take her, less than a mile from the crossroads where Robert Johnson allegedly sold his soul to the devil, and not 60 miles from where it all began, where the Southern crosses the Yellow Dog.